You bought your boat. It's absolutely perfect. It has everything you want. All the features, the accessories, the perfect size, great motors. Your family is thrilled with it. But there's one problem. You don't like the name. In this episode, we are going to talk about denaming and renaming your boat, the various rituals and superstitions that accompany that, and how you can avoid angering the sea gods. Stay tuned. Hey everybody, and welcome to the first episode of 2022. So, renaming your boat. It's kind of a big deal, trust me on that one. And you can go about it a couple of ways. One is to employ time-tested ritual that will appease the sea gods and goddesses and ensure that you have safe passage for yourself and your crew. And the other way, which is far less fun, is just to scrape the old name off the transom, talk to a graphics designer, and a company to slap the new stuff on the back. But where's the fun in that? So in this episode, I want to explore a couple of things. One is the history of boat christening. Why has it been done? And it seems to tie into something within the very psyche of people because it's cross-cultural, it goes across time, and throughout the world you'll find people evoking certain gods and goddesses of the sea and trying to appease them in order to have safe passage, avoid pirates, gales, storms, or accident. The second part is a denaming ceremony. I'll tell you what I did, and there are lots of resources online where you can find something that may suit you a little bit better. The third, the christening ceremony itself, which is kind of a big deal, and it can be a fun and social event. Jacqueline actually took some footage when we christened our first boat, Mzungu, back in 2018. So I'll show you that a little later on. And finally, and most importantly, what do you use as a christening libation? I know champagne seems to be the typical choice, but it hasn't always been that way, and it certainly doesn't need to stay that way. So we'll talk about that. As always, if you like what you see, hit the like button, click subscribe, and tell your friends. Okay, let's get started. What's the history of boat naming ceremonies? I will say that much of our ritual in North America and Western Europe, or European-influenced areas, is based on Greek and Roman mythology, with the sea god Poseidon or Neptune being the god who is generally appeased. Now, certainly there are differences. For example, Scandinavia, or you go into Africa or Polynesian societies and cultures. But the one common thread always seems to be getting the protection of the god. In a similar way that a slave would be buried in the foundations or killed and their blood sprinkled on the foundations to appease the god, to ensure that the house is solid, which is a strange architectural practice, is very similar to offer a human sacrifice to ensure the protection of the god for the launching of that boat. The Vikings, you hear various stories, either they would use slaves as the rollers or the skids as they're launching their boat, or they would just simply sacrifice a slave and pour their blood on the boat as that way of sacrifice. For the Polynesian societies, it was slightly different. The Fijians would apparently kill numerous slaves to have the launching of a canoe, but if you look at Maori society, with one of the articles I read, it would just be possibly a single person who was killed, and that was only in the case of the larger war canoes. But regardless, there seems to be a disturbing trend throughout history of human sacrifice and red blood on the boat at the time of launching. For some of the less bloodthirsty practices, the Greeks, for example, would wear olive laurels around their heads, drink wine and pour water on the boat to bless it. The Babylonians would sacrifice an ox. Other cultures would sacrifice sheep or goats. And in fact, the Viking tradition, once they became Christianized, replaced the human sacrifice with an animal sacrifice on the boat. There was certainly a religious aspect to the christening ceremonies, whether Christian or animist or other types of religions. In Britain, in the Middle Ages and later, you'd get priests or other holy men on board, sprinkle holy water, bless the ship, and eventually, as this carried on, animal sacrifices fell out of favor, and it became more and more common, again, certainly in the Western European and British tradition, to use red wine instead of red blood. Following on to this was the concept of a cup, a silver cup at the christening of a vessel that would be filled with wine, shared among the notables that were there for the christening of the ship, and then blessing the boat by pouring wine on the 4 cardinal points on the bow of the ship, and then throwing the cup overboard to maybe fall into the sea and serve as a gift to the god to ensure the safety of the ship and her crew. Now, as you can imagine, silver goblets and chalices aren't exactly cheap, and if you are throwing one into the sea every time you christen a boat, and if you're a massive naval power like Britain was in its heyday, that's a whole lot of silver going over the side. Now, they tried reusing the cups for a while by putting nets out there, but that seems kind of ridiculous. By the time of the early Georges, so King George III-ish, so in the 18th century, they started breaking bottles of wine on the bow of the boat. By about 1810, the early 1800s, it became customary to ask a lady to christen the boat on behalf of the royalty or the notables who had commissioned the ship in the first place. So in a nutshell, this is how we get from human sacrifices and red blood on boats to bottles of red wine. Part 2, the denaming ceremony. Why do you want to dename your boat? Well, because you want to put a new name on it, but you also don't want to anger the sea gods. Poseidon has the ledger of the deep, and in mythology, this is the list of all the boats that have ever been or are on the water. And I guess what you have to do is remove the old name from the ledger so that Poseidon knows, and then put the new name on top of that. And again, it's all about appeasing the sea gods. The ceremony isn't the work. Doing all the lead-in up to the ceremony is the work. In this denaming ritual, you have gone through the boat and removed every single piece of identification with that old boat's name. Now that involves taking it off the transom, use a scraper and chemicals, but also hard copy documents like surveys, maintenance records, receipts, things like that. I've cut out the name of the old boat on the hard copy and I put them aside. I'll explain why later. But even online with PDF documents and surveys, I've whited out or painted over the old name of the boat. The whole point is that when you're done, there is no memory or memento with that old boat's name on your boat. Once you've done all that, you are ready for the denaming ceremony, which is also a great time to invite some friends and have a couple of libations for the sea god, of course, and to go through the ritual itself. There are many ways to do this. An online search is actually surprising in how many variations of a theme there are. Here's what I did. Took all those clippings and memories of that old boat, or the name rather, and I set it on fire. And then with the ashes and a suitable libation to the sea gods and a bit of an invocation, the ashes went into the water. And there, that was it. The boat's old name no longer existed in the ledger of the deep. Now, if you're looking for a suitable invocation, here's one that I found online, and I'll post the link below.
In the name of all who have sailed aboard this ship in the past, and in the name of all who may sail aboard her in the future, we invoke the ancient gods of the wind and the sea to favor us with their blessing today. Mighty Neptune, king of all that moves in or on the waves, and mighty Aeolus, guardian of the winds and all that blows before them, we offer you our thanks for this protection you have afforded this vessel in the past. We voice our gratitude that she has always been found shelter from tempest and storm and enjoyed safe passage to port. Now, wherefore, we submit this supplication that the name whereby this vessel has hitherto been known be struck and removed from your records. Further, we ask that when she is again presented for blessing with another name, she shall be recognized and shall be accorded once again the self-same privileges she previously enjoyed. In return for which we rededicate this vessel to your domain in full knowledge that she shall be subject, as always, to the immutable laws of the gods of the wind and the sea. In consequence whereof, and in good faith, we seal this pact with a libation offered according to the hallowed ritual of the sea.
That is, of course, only a recommendation. The point being, your denaming ceremony, ideally with some family and friends, has been completed. Hooray! Your boat doesn't have a name. What do you do next? Well, of course, you have the naming ceremony. The naming ceremony is actually really easy compared to all the stuff you went through for the denaming process. And it's as easy as pouring a libation on the bow and saying a few appropriate words. And it can be as simple as, I christen this boat, insert boat name here, may she bring fair winds and good fortune to all who sail on her. That's it. Your boat now has a new name. Now here's a hint. Don't bring any merchandise and don't put the new boat name on until you've actually done the ceremony, because that apparently is bad luck. Now that's one example of how you can do a naming ceremony. Jacqueline took a clip from 2018 when we christened our 280 Sundancer Mzungu. So I think you'll enjoy this. Before we christen the boat, I'm going to say a few words. I knew that when I first saw you, that this is the boat I wanted. We're not going to christen you with champagne because that's weak. We're going to christen you with whiskey from the Orkney Islands, settled by Vikings who traveled on the water and were able to navigate and find their way. We're going to give you a name of wandering, and we hope you'll always find your way. I christen you Mzungu.
Yay!
Congratulations, you now have a name.
How did that feel?
And there's enough left to drink. Wow, I sure poured a whole bunch on the bow, but it seems to have worked. Neptune was appeased, or Poseidon, and we had great times, and we did have good fortune in Mzungu. That was an awesome boat. So, that's the naming ceremony. But there was going to be a fourth point of discussion for this video, and that is the libation itself. What do you use? Ultimately, what you use as a christening liquid to name your boat is entirely up to you. I do not recommend human blood or human sacrifices, but check your local jurisdiction first. The choice of liquid is varied over time. For the United States Navy in their early days, wine was used. The USS Shannon was blessed with whiskey. I fully support that decision. Other ships, they've taken water from different rivers and tributaries and used that to christen the boat. It varies entirely. Grape juice is absolutely fine. Water, anything at all. What's important is that the sea gods know that you mean this sincerely and that you want to name your boat and ensure that the ledger of the deep is kept fully up to date. Although in the modern era, we don't take these rituals seriously, or certainly as seriously as they did hundreds of years ago, there's always an element of superstition to sailors and seafarers, and always trying to get the luck to turn in your own favor. These ceremonies are a link to our past, a link to the water, and a link to some very fundamental beliefs that we have as people. And they're fun. And currently, renaming a boat is a great social time, be with friends, and share some of the libation that you initially gave to the sea god.